Welcome back to Asian Art. Today we're going to continue our discussion of Chinese painting and discuss the developments that occurred in the Song Dynasty with the development of landscape painting. The Northern Song Dynasty emerged out of the Tang Dynasty and was, like the earlier Tang Dynasty, immediately very powerful, bold, confident in its power and its exercise of power. But the Northern Song Dynasty, it became known, was continually being attacked from the north by the Mongols who lived in the northern sort of the Western Russia, and it's now Russia, and moving down into the region, eventually captured the capital of Kaifeng, crossing the Great Wall of China, and forcing China to the kingdom of the Song Dynasty to kind of regroup further south in another dynasty. The Southern Song Dynasty is typically a period where we have this sense of introspection, and landscape painting emerges out of this. And many people have pointed out that landscape becomes an art during a time of dramatic change and dramatic upheaval. There's sort of a need to sort of ground ourselves in some way with the presence of the world around us. So let's take a look at a landscape painting, one of the very famous landscape paintings here. They're called shanshui, which literally translates into mountain water. Shanshui, as you see here, are these towering mountains, sort of riven with tiny streams that cut through the rocks. These imposing mountains are surrounded with a base of mist. And then you see these sort of craggy mountains, and pine trees are usually sort of clinging to this. So we see this sort of imposing and powerful presence of nature. This particular painting by Fan Quan is called Travelers Amid Rocks and Streams, and you would have to look very close to actually see the subject of this painting. They are right at the very bottom of the painting, right in an area you can see a sort of a line of small dots in just below where the tree line is over there. In this area, the travelers are minuscule compared to the super present and powerful landscape. This is, again, like a Taoist idea that human beings are insignificant in front of the sort of power of the world of the natural world. I pointed out here on the far right is the Chinese character for mountain. And one of the things that you see in this painting is not only is that it is a mountain, but it's no mountain in particular. There is no actual mountain that looks like this. This is painted from the Fan Quan's imagination and memory of seeing mountains like this in southern and northern China. And so this way in which he is sort of recalling this mountain is a way that he wants it to powerfully exist, not just as a specific mountain, but as an ideal mountain. And to communicate this idea that it is this sort of idealized mountain, even though it looks like a very particular mountain, the composition of this painting sort of speaks in the Chinese language of the character mountain. So if you look at the character over on the left and you compare it to the picture, you can see a kind of similarity. Let me show you. You can superimpose them. You can see how the character of mountain and the composition sort of align in a very interesting way. So with our understanding of this character and the idea of mountain, and this idea of mountainness. We have a long tradition in China of this, the way in which a mountain is a kind of symbolic abode of the gods, a place of fertility and abundance. And so it presents a sense of an ideal world, a place that is just outside our reach, that is, in a sense, a kind of source of fertility and a source of power. So if you're a Chinese scholar and you're sitting in your studio and you're wanting to paint a mountain without actually having a mountain around, you might turn to a rather extraordinary rock sitting on your desk. This is known as the scholar's stones, gongxi. And these rocks, these extraordinary rocks, would be set up on a nice wooden pedestal. And it's from these rocks that the artists sort of gain a kind of sense of rockiness and how to capture the essence of rocks and rockiness in their paintings. And so they might look to this as a kind of inspiration for their mountain paintings. Now, gaohui like this were rocks found in nature for the most part, but they were also very artfully carved and shaped in a way that they were to make them look even more natural. So they're not entirely natural. They were made to appear like they had a sense of the organic in them. I find that interesting, that something that is made to represent the ideal of rockiness had to be sort of edited or adjusted or amended to improve on its ability to express perfect rockiness. So the purpose is not exactly to reproduce the appearance of a particular kind of nature, but to grasp the emotion and to capture the rhythm of nature. And there's a word for this when they're talking about painting. Look closer at this painting to examine the Koo, and you can see with extraordinary clarity the sort of broken pine trees and their twisting branches. It's very, very expressive and beautifully delineated. And that kind of precision and expert mark making is really what defines excellent Koo in the painting. So at the end of the southern Sung Dynasty, it would be overrun by the Mongols, and it would be forced into a wholly new society shaped by the Mongols, which became known as the Yuan Dynasty. And as you see, the Yuan Dynasty unified much of China. The Mongols were a very powerful military force that used horses very effectively, and were able to eventually overrun and control all of what is known as China today, and more. Because the Mongol territory was connected through a family lineage that swept across much of Asia, down into India, and all the way into almost into Macedonia, Greece. In this huge territory, this Mongol territory, Kublai Khan and Genghis Khan were the presumptive rulers, and we also had in India, we've already talked about the Mughal court, the Mughal court by Shah Jahan, the maker of the Taj Mahal. They were also genetically related to the Mongols who would conquer China. This was a difficult time in China for ethnic, what they call Han Chinese, and they would be persecuted, and the whole social structure of China would be inverted. Scholars would very often be persecuted, or they would lose their jobs or be forced to work, and they were no longer the peak of society. Merchants, which were considered sort of a kind of lowly and disrespectful kind of business. To deal in money matters was not something the ethnic Chinese thought of as being very valuable. This was sort of a Confucian idea. They also found themselves now in a new area of superiority. And so in this time period, here you see the image of the horse, which was once an image of power and an image of the confidence of China. Now you see this emaciated painting of a horse by Gong Kai. And in it, he makes his commentary that, China has broken, it is starved, and it is no longer anything but a dim shadow of what it once was. And so this is a way in which the painter, who had lost his livelihood and was sort of forced to, take up odd jobs to make a living, this is his commentary on the state of China today. Another very famous painter from this time in the Yuan Dynasty, his name was Chung Mong Koo. Unlike Gong Kai, Chung Mong Koo actually decided to work and stay in the government, where he became an official. It is believed that he decided that he could do what he could to alleviate the suffering of the ethnic Chinese by working with the Mongols. However, he may have felt doubts about this work and questioned his decision. This is a very curious painting by Chung Mong Koo. It's a painting of a sheep and a goat. His commentary, you see right between the sheep and the goat above them there. He simply says, "I've painted horses, but I'd never painted a sheep and a goat. They're sort of like life, but they don't rival anything a master could do." So there's a kind of modesty in his message and a kind of, I just decided to do a sheep and a goat. And it may very well be that's all he intended to do. But as later commentators have pointed out, the image of the sheep and goat refers back to an ancient Chinese story about a general who, after his dynasty had been overthrown, he refused to work with the violent Qin dynasty. Instead, left the country and went up into the hills and raised sheep and goats. And so these images may be a kind of longing for a simpler life, one detached from his responsibilities, working under the Mongols. Chung Mong Koo was a very influential painter and a celebrated calligrapher, and his paintings are quite evocative. They're spare, they're simple, they're expressive. Here in his painting, Twin Pines, Level Distance, we begin to see emerge a new kind of painting, one that still feels very realistic. But as you get closer to actually look at the painting, you start to become more aware that the painting is not a picture of trees and rocks, is a picture of brushstrokes, that we become more aware of the way he's painting these, that the brushstrokes are beginning to look more and more like the marks from calligraphy rather than the marks from a painting. And Chung Mong Koo is one of these first artists who sort of brings calligraphy and painting together, so that in a way we're no longer looking at painting as a sort of window into another world. We're actually looking at this painting as an object. This is a rather radical departure from traditions of the past, and it's predicated on a kind of philosophical change that's happening in China at this time. Now, to explain this change, I have to go back in time to a period many centuries earlier, with the arrival of a Buddhist monk named Tommo. Tommo was a monk from India who comes to China sometime in the 5th century. And he is here to teach people about Buddhism. And when he arrives in China, he says, "Oh, you got it all wrong. You don't understand Buddhism at all." And he explains to his Chinese students that it's not important how the Buddha became enlightened, or even what the Buddha said so much. You need to prepare yourself for enlightenment, and you must do that directly by clearing your mind and not meditating on anything, but trying to become fully present. And so this was a shift in Chinese Buddhism that occurred at this time. It opened up new possibilities. Not everyone followed this new direction, but Tommo, as you see pictured here in a 9th century fresco from Central Asia, the sort of ugly guy on the left opening his hand in a mudra of teaching, is expressing in these new ideas to the Chinese monk who is receiving this wisdom. So Tommo was basing his ideas on some very early understandings of Buddhist teaching. It is said that when the Buddha was alive, he gave many sermons, but on one occasion, he came before his assembled students and he didn't say a word. Instead, he merely held up a flower. And this merest gesture, the merest gesture of holding up this flower, was his entire message. And with that, many people in his gathering gained enlightenment. They saw and understood what the Buddha was saying when he said nothing at all. And so Tommo takes this idea that you can achieve this enlightenment not through sort of conventional ways of thinking, but by sort of opening yourself up to the moment, to be fully present. And he did that by, telling people, well, you just can't sit there and mumble and meditate on what Buddha said. You need to prepare your body and your mind. And so he introduced these sort of martial spiritual practices. He said monks are getting too flabby, and so he trained them in some martial arts. And he brought them into a kind of bright clarity in their meditation. It's also said he's important bringing tea drinking into the meditative Buddhist practices. Tea drinking had been around, is considered kind of a medicine, but he said tea with its caffeine will keep you awake, it'll keep you alert, and it'll keep you focused. And so that's why Tommo is often shown with these sort of piercing, bulging eyes, as he's a person who is really about looking and being present. Now, about this idea of martial arts and Chan Buddhism, this is a very interesting connection. And in fact, martial arts have a very long history in China. We know that because going all the way back to the Yuan Dynasty with our terracotta soldiers, we see that there was an elite group of soldiers in his army who carried no weapons and no armor at all. You can see one here. Notice that he's standing in a martial arts pose, which is called the horse stance, which is a sort of a classic pose, which is different from standing at attention like all the other soldiers. These soldiers were trained to launch into the enemy camp and use the enemy's own weapons against themselves. They were super fast and super deadly. They were not a main part of the fighting force, but they provided in a very important way of breaking up and creating chaos within the ranks of the enemy. And so we see that martial arts have played a very important part. Martial arts are very closely associated with Taoism very early on in Chinese philosophy, and a lot of the early texts on martial arts are closely associated to Taoists' ideas of yin and yang. But when Chan Buddhism comes along, Buddhism comes into this as well. And most of the martial arts monasteries in China today. The very famous ones, of course, are Wudan, and all of these have a Buddhist element in them as well now, that this kind of Chan Buddhism and martial arts. So martial arts had a certain philosophy of yin and yang, but now they're sort of more deeply infused with this idea of Buddhism as well. Chan Buddhism, let's get back to our discussion on painting, has a very interesting impact on the visual arts as well. This idea of dhyana, meditation, promotes this way of looking at things in a much more spontaneous way, which is called the Boneless Style. Remember earlier, as I mentioned, talking about Koo, the bone structure, a sort of clearly delineated line work that, defined and described things with this sort of precision. By moving away from that and creating a kind of looser gestural line work, the figure seems more spontaneous, as if it was created in an instant. Here is a very famous painting by Liang Kai of the poet Li Taipo, or Lipo, from the mid-13th century on paper. In this painting, we can see the poet caught in the moment of speaking. And he is, you're going to take a look at his face here. You can see how very simple, how concentrated the look of the face is. There's a wonderful simplicity to the face, just the barest essence of what is needed to express the act of speaking. And here, the poem I chose for this is a poem by Li Taipo. Seeing moonlight here at my bed and thinking it is frost on the ground. I look up, gaze at the mountain moon and back, dreaming of my old home. So in this poem, and that is the complete poem, Li Taipo is trying to express a moment of confusion initially, seeing moonlight and thinking it's snow, but then a kind of revelation. Oh, it's snow. It's not snow, it's moonlight. And this idea of this revelation that comes from that, the sort of the idea of the moonlight being this thing in his life. The moon, of course, is symbolic of Buddhist enlightenment. And here, in this case, the way in which the physical world can deceive our perceptions is another important Buddhist theme in this very brief poem. But it's very grounded in the here and now. It's a very tiny moment. It's not trying to be profound. It has an intimacy and a sense of immediacy about it, which is very characteristic of the Chan Buddhist philosophy. Here is one of the earliest examples we have of this boneless style painting. This is a pair of paintings, hence the title Two Chan Patriarchs. The second painting in this set is elsewhere. But in this painting here, we see a Buddhist monk resting against a tiger. As you see that just beautifully expressive line work that creates the shoulder and the back. You could clearly make out that sense of emotional urgency and swiftness that this was created with. It's very expressive, and we're sort of aware of the fact that this is a brush painting. We can see the illusion of the monk and the tiger, but we are also at the same time very evidently aware of the fact that this is an ink painting. And I think this is tension that this creates is very interesting in the sense of this Buddhist idea of working against the illusory nature of reality. Now let's move on back to our subject of landscape painting, as I talk about another artist, Nansan, who works during the Yuan Dynasty. Nansan was a scholar official who, after the overthrow of the Song Dynasty, and he decided not to work with the Yuan Dynasty and to kind of distance himself from all of that and persecution from the Mongols, he basically gave everything away. His land, his home, everything. And he moved into a tiny houseboat. And there, living off gifts that his friends could give him, he basically just painted. And he had this very simple life. And because he sort of retreated from this world in this kind of monkish way and cultivated this idea of being at a distance from the court and its intrigues, he has a very powerful influence. Almost by not having or wanting to have any influence, he strangely becomes very influential. Nansan's paintings, you see, are very spare, very simple, and they sort of remove a lot of this idea of skill and artistry and try and capture a kind of immediacy and simplicity, much in a kind of Chan Buddhist way. So here in the long quote you see up above, part of it is translated to the left when he says, "What I call painting does not exceed the joy of careless sketching with the brush. I do not seek formal likeness, but do it simply for my own amusement. How can one scold a eunuch for not growing a beard?" So in this statement, he's saying, sure, you could call what I do painting, but I don't. It's just kind of something I'm doing. When you call it a painting, that's because you expect it to look like a painting, and I don't. And his last comment here, how could you scold a eunuch for not growing a beard? You're saying I'm a bad painter because, but I never claimed I was a painter at all, right? And so he is trying to sort of distance himself from those categories and expectations that tradition has set upon the act of painting. And this is sort of a kind of radical departure from it. His brushstrokes are spare and minimal, and they have a kind of dry emptiness to them. And the architecture is very rudimentary and suggests a kind of, distance to a skilled draftsman. Here is another painting on paper by Nansan. And here in his inscription on the upper right, you can see he writes, "In a forest pavilion, bamboo and trees give thickly overlapping shade. Seeking friends, crying ying, I too am fond of music." And so here he's basically saying, I'm having a great life, hanging out, enjoying nature, and just listening to beautiful music. Then he switches tone here. He says, reciting to strings, gathered scholars are from time to time arranged and seated, which is basically saying, back in the capital, those scholars, they get to listen, they get to stand up and act and be told what to do. And but he admonishes them, reminding them of an old Confucian story. In his district, Master Fu had only to play the chin. So he's saying that Master Fu was this governor of a district who was the Confucian ideal. He never had to tell anyone anything. He would play his instrument, the chin, and people would hear him play, and they were so moved by the beauty and the elegance of his music that they all went about their business and nobody ever did anything untoward or inappropriate because they were all inspired to do the right thing. It's sort of this idea of that harmonious society can emerge if people are uplifted to think of higher and nobler thoughts. Let's take a closer look at Nansan's painting. You can see the sort of dry, simple brushstrokes that make up his painting. The architecture, again, is very basic, and the line work is simple to the point of being crude. This kind of inelegance, this sort of lack of artistry, this sort of dedicated amateur is the kind of ways that people see this. This becomes a very important and influential movement in Chinese landscape painting for the next few centuries.